So, Leah, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today. You specialize in an area that's very important to the course that students are taking, particularly around the social impact of technology in democracy and the activities of activists, which are very important today. So, but I thought what I'd do is just start by talking about your overall focus and giving people an introduction to that. You focus particularly on media, information technologies, and social change. So, do you want to just give an introduction to that for the students?
Sure. I think, from the communication or media perspective, one thing that has been a long time concern in the field of communication and in media studies too is what difference media make for the way society is, for what we believe about ourselves, for our practices, for just the whole way that we organize ourselves and conduct everyday life. And this can range all the way from the very micro level that is often called diffusion of innovations work, which says how do new ideas or new practices spread from person to person within a community, and sometimes beyond that. We have also seen this in the interest with media and the kinds of governance systems that seem to be supported by media. For example, mass media, if we're talking about all the way back to the beginnings of print and print publication, and then later when things like film came along, cinema, photography, broadcasting, each one of those was seen as having a particular kind of consequence for society, for politics, but just generally for the way that people understood the world, what their beliefs are, those kinds of things. So, in fact, for example, one of our usual assumptions is that mass media, from the very beginning, from being the first mass production technology, in fact, was print, all the way forward has been associated with democracy because of the distribution of ideas, the distribution of information and knowledge and sharing knowledge. So there's that factor to it. And more recently today, we've scaled up even further. This is not brand new by any means, but the idea of global communications and information flows is also a big concern for this field and related fields that are concerned about communication at all. So that's kind of the general viewpoint in communication. But for me, this interest started when I was in graduate school, and some of my advisors and teachers, people like Bill Dutton, who is the founder of the Oxford Internet Institute, Jorge Reyna Chement, we were looking back then, this is the early 80s, at what was called information society studies. The basic question was, we know what kinds of social changes were associated with industrialism, for example, when we had urbanization, when we had the factory model, when we had Fordism and Taylorism and rationalization of production and those kinds of things. People moving off the farms, lots understood about that. But at the time, in the 1970s, we were really beginning to see not just broadcasting and global transmission of media content, but then the introduction of computing, large-scale computing, big iron, we used to call it, right? The big mainframe computers, then connecting those computers via telecommunications links. So we had this convergence of telecommunications and computing that was going on, which wasn't kind of diffused out into everyday life so much, but was making a huge difference in terms of economic production. It was making a huge difference in terms of defense. It was making a big changes were afoot with this growth of this global system. And so what we were interested in was the rise of information and knowledge and that kind of work associated with the production of information, with the circulation of information. in the bigger world, in society at large, not just for individual nations now, but for the whole global prospect. And so our question was, if we know what the changes were associated with industrialism in an earlier age, what kinds of changes are going to be associated with these new kinds of practices and networks? And of course, in the beginning, this was something that only governments and the largest corporate organizations really had any access to. But eventually, with miniaturization and kind of a lot of different technological changes that we know about historically, these kinds of technologies got into the hands of now literally everyone. We all have, one of these, right? Walking around with us. The whole idea that we have a personal computer on our person, literally on our person, all the time. So in that kind of 40-year span, that there have been some huge changes about, and these are the kinds of questions we were starting to look at in the 1980s. What are the consequences for the family? What are the consequences for trade? What are the consequences for national defense? What are the consequences for education, for knowledge at every level, from little kids all the way through the most sophisticated kinds of technical training? Every aspect of society basically has now been completely suffused with these technologies. And so the area that I am most interested in is in what sense the technologies don't cause change, right? But we design them and we adopt them and we use them in ways that advance what we want. And we hope. And what kinds of changes come along with that, right? So that's my broad interest. And over about the last, 15 years, I've gotten very interested in the uses of newer information technologies and internet-enabled technologies among social activists, social and cultural activists. And so that's kind of a subfield of that, which when I started off about 15 years ago, there weren't, you could kind of count the specialists in this on one hand who were really making a difference. But now it's just become an enormous field of study. So lots of people are recognizing that the technologies have something to do with change, and activism is one of those modes of bringing about change. And so you mix the two, you've got the technological and you've got the practice of activism, and that's kind of where we are right now.
Wonderful, and a great introduction, very broad. We're going to go into detail in a few of these areas, not all of them, but some of them. And really as you've said, to understand the impact that changes in communications technology are having on various areas of life. You're looking at broad trends in some of those areas, but you're especially concerned about how people use that technology for change. So what you've very importantly, I think, said is that it's not about the technology doing things itself, it's what we do with it. And so you're especially looking at, okay, what can we do with this and what are we choosing to do with the technology? And so my second question is really starting to get into that with the condition of democracy. How is, or what are the main elements of the political environment that we think about as being impacted by information technology?
Well, I think there's a lot of commentary going on right now, especially in more developed nations, about the challenges to democracy that are out there. This is the central obsession that we have in the United States right now, for obvious reasons, for political reasons. But we're not alone. There has been a very strong swing toward authoritarian styles of governing, especially over last 10 years, 15 years, something like that. And we see it in Europe, we see it in Asia, we see it of course, throughout the world, and in sometimes in surprising places. So the first thing to say is that if we're thinking about the political or the public sphere, democracy, which, as I said before, has so often been associated with certain kinds of communications media, now we're kind of seeing a difference, a delinking, or even the idea that maybe some of these channels of communication that have been developed and created on these new global platforms maybe aren't so good for democracy. So we are hearing those kinds of critiques and those kinds of worries expressed. Also, the difficulty is that some of the main historical proponents for democracy, and we're talking about we're talking about some of the European, especially the countries in the post-Soviet period out of Eastern Europe, who are nominally democratic but are swinging authoritarian. India is undergoing some huge changes right now with increasingly conservative and religious politics kind of approach. Anyway, there's a lot of different examples throughout the world where these challenges are going on, and one of the major questions right now is what do our modes of communication, our means of spreading information, sharing information, creating it, circulating it, disposing of it, what goes away, ends up being a very important issue. So there's a real tendency right now to associate the current communications climate, and I mean that both interpersonally, organizationally, as well as in the mediated space, and what's going on with our politics. So we, for example, in the United States, we like to hold ourselves up as a great example for everybody else in the world about democracy, but we haven't been a good model for a while. And this enables other nations, other leaders to point to us and say, see, it doesn't even work there. So our system is more likely to be correct. This is basically the claim that the People's Republic of China is making now, that there is no necessary linkage between democracy and the kinds of civil sphere, the kind of communication, open communication and speech rights that we take for granted, that we associate together. So there's one example. One thing I think we should say is that there's nothing any more special about information technology. It's so diffused. It is so commonplace. It has become kind of the expected way for everyday life just to be conducted. So because it is so commonplace, because it's so prevalent, pervasive, it's kind of in every aspect of what we do. So it's logical to say, in what sense has this immersive environment now affected our politics in some fundamental ways? And is that going to be a good thing? Is that going to be a bad thing? Keeping in mind that originally, back in those days that I was talking about when we were looking at information society issues, one of the assumptions was that because these technologies would be able to get information right to individuals, tailored possibly for what they were interested in, that it would radically democratize information and therefore create more opportunity for more democracy. The way that it was talked about was that it is though the internet, if you will, as though there's just one thing called the internet, but these kinds of network technologies were inherently democratic. And I think we are now confronting the fact that that's not necessarily so. And we're not quite sure what to do about it, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, when I started teaching the course that this video is for, it was right at the time when the Arab Spring was taking place. That we're talking today about the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring.
Yes.
But in the classroom at that time, we were able to connect to Al Jazeera, who had the best feed at that time of
Yes.
the demonstrations in Tahrir Square. And at the start of the class, I would say, well, what's happening now? For the couple of weeks or so that was happening in Tahrir Square, we were able to watch it and really consider what all this meant. Not just, of course, the demonstrations, but the technologies that were around that, including the broadcast of it live from Tahrir Square in Cairo. And so that was my next question, really, is what happened to Arab Spring? Because, as you've said, there were people who at that time said, the world is now going to very quickly democratize because of the internet. And of course, that has not happened. So what's your interpretation of that? What do you think happened?
Well, I think that ideology of the idea of the technology being inherently democratic had kind of escaped from researchers and people who were kind of think tank, thought leader type people out into the general public. There was this faith that the technology somehow had these characteristics that would overcome established power, that could kind of, it's the old line about, I forget if it was John Barlow or who said, but the internet sees censorship as damage and routes around it, right? There was this old line. Well, in this case, one of the things that had happened since the earlier days of the internet is the emergence of social media. And people naturally thought, well, social media is the next incarnation of this kind of potential for democracy, for democratic communication. The difficulty, and I think what people didn't recognize as much, is that while social media were wonderful for organizing, for mobilizing people, okay, getting people in the street, it was superb. And we have seen this in lots of ways. We saw it with the Women's March the day after President Trump was inaugurated, for example. Protests all over the world have been mobilized at scale using social media in a remarkable way. But that's because they are relatively centralized. One of the things that happens with social media, and once you move to these big platforms, they're centralized. It's a walled garden. It's very, very large, remarkably large, which is the power of the mobilization, the power of getting people on board. But at the same time, that makes it relatively easy to choke. Okay, and that's precisely what happened in Egypt, for sure. We saw something like that in Turkey with Gezi. We saw in several different places in the Arab Spring moment. And I think what surprised people is how quickly, the Egyptian government kind of let it play out a little bit more. In fact, Manuel Castells, in his book Networks of Outrage and Hope, has a really nice chapter. I'll give him a little shout out because he really has a wonderful account, both at kind of the global level and then from people who were there, about the government's reaction to the use of social media at Tahrir and how they kind of kept hands off for a little while. But when they began to try and put the chokehold on the social media that the demonstrators were using, they found workarounds. And that's one of the great hopes for these kinds of networks. But I think that we lost sight of the fact that what social networks are, what they represent, is an enclosure of the internet. Okay, it's like this little chunk over here, that little chunk over there, and we don't want you to do a whole lot of crosstalk unless we own the same platforms. It's not the same thing as the pre-social media internet, where it was kind of access to everything all the time, where most people from the time of the introduction of the World Wide Web in 1989, were using the internet through browsers, which basically said, I can search, I can find lots of different things, I can go to different sites on my own volition. I can figure things out for myself. Whereas social media platforms were designed to be funnels, right? To bring a lot of people and a lot of ideas and a lot of content and so forth, narrow it down and point it right at you as an individual. And so there's a degree of centralization with social media that I think in many ways, people like Tarleton Gillespie have talked about this with platforms, that it really was a move away from the original idea of the architecture of the internet. It's a very fundamentally different idea. And so one of the things that I think the consequences for movements like the Arab Spring was that they were a bit surprised how quickly it's a little bit like broadcasting. In the old days, when the first thing that people would do is take over the TV station or the radio station, right? And so there was always a fight, or the printing presses. The government might try and shut down by depriving you of newsprint, so you couldn't print the paper, those kinds of things, because they had a centralized choke point. The World Wide Web version kind of the internet, both pre-browsers and post-browsers, was a much more open landscape. But social media began to tighten that down again and make it look more like old style media, okay? Like a media feed, like content feed. So they turned out to be relatively easy to subvert, relatively easy to control. We still have to give credit to platforms like Twitter, which worked hard to keep in touch with the activists at for Tahrir, for example. Under any circumstances, they were maintaining links and trying to find workarounds whenever the government was trying to shut them down. So they were kind of working with the activists as well. But I think the disappointment that we're feeling right now, and keep in mind too that the Arab Spring was also kind of consequent to the global economic meltdown, right? And the austerity that came along with that. We saw big uprisings in the UK, for example, right around the same time, for some of the same reasons, but for different kinds of governance and so forth. So social media turned out to be not quite everything the internet could be, if you know what I mean. And that's the way that I kind of think about it. So now people are saying the internet didn't work, or social media didn't save us. Well, it wasn't going to unless the architecture changed, and it didn't.
So those who were very optimistic at that time perhaps were assuming the old architecture and not really understanding the new.
I think there's something to that, yeah. That there was something inherent about just being online that was going to be emancipatory, right? And it's not, because at the same time as it allows us to express ourselves and contact people we never thought we could find or have immediate access to a breadth of information, it also gives that whole world immediate access to us. And so one of the things that, and we'll talk more about this, but the whole question of data capture, surveillance, it's the flip side of this. And you can be surveilled by the phone in your pocket much better than you can be surveilled by your TV set or your radio. Those are changing now as it becomes more digital, but part of the ability to engage in this kind of activism is the security that you can act without constantly being surveilled, without that you can share ideas, that you can mobilize, you can associate with people without somebody looking over your shoulder and trying to stop you from doing that.
Okay, well, that brings us nicely on to the next question, which is around what activists are doing with technology today and how this has changed activism from the past. You've led into that a bit already. but more explicitly, what's different about activism today? Perhaps about who are more or less powerful, who might be participating, and how are they organizing?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting cases to me right now, which is a little bit tragic, but shows a lot of resourcefulness, has been the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. One of the things that I've learned by looking at the Hong Kong example is how those activists have begun to adapt new kinds of applications. They have built new kinds of applications. They're being much more savvy about data security, being much more careful of, and aware of the fact that the surveillance can happen and trying to contend with that, kind of get into this cat and mouse, because they know that the authorities, they know that law enforcement have ways of surveilling them. So they're trying to find these workarounds more actively than perhaps a decade ago. People were not as aware of what options they had, or, that kind of tech savviness might not have been there. So I think the activists that I'm seeing, the cases that I think are most interesting, are the ones where it's not, oh, forget it, we're not going to use social media anymore. Rather, they're finding different platforms, they are finding secure platforms. They are far more aware of what the law is around how to use these personal devices. For example, in the United States, our law says that if I'm at a protest and I'm using my little gizmo here, there are all kinds of places that say, here's how to set up your phone. And here's the apps absolutely not to be using because they're going to be surveilled. So how do you communicate with your friends? Here are some alternatives that are more secure. Here are some collectives that are, actually developing these applications specifically for the protest situation. And in the United States, for example, if you are stopped at or arrested at a demonstration, they can make you give your fingerprint for fingerprint identification, right? The police can do that, but they can't make you give the code to unlock your phone. So know that, right? Set it up so that you do not have a biometric ID into your phone. So lots of people are getting smarter. I think that the activist leadership are very concerned about the safety and the well-being of the people who come out and the people associated with them. So I think that's one thing that's very interesting, is this move toward being smarter about what the capacities of the technology are and how to use them smarter.
Fascinating, and much more complex, perhaps. Certainly a lot more knowledge required than when I was a student or younger as an activist.
Oh, yes.
And things were much simpler. But now there's a level of technical capability that is required to be able to be a successful activist.
Yes, and I think, this is associated with another thing we'll talk about, but this question of data. I think everyone is now well aware that what the internet is about is data capture, first and foremost. It may feel like a convenience and a way for me to talk to my mom, but really at the end of the day, the way that the operators of these various sites and applications view it is as data harvesting. That's the way it works. And so if we as consumers or as activists or as users of any type understand this, then we may be able to adapt and use our technology smarter.
So we've talked about what activists are doing. What are governments doing as far as their use of data around citizen engagement and perhaps control?
Yeah. This is an enormous topic. This is in line with activism. There's also been an enormous outpouring of research over the last decade about politics and government and internet uses therein. And it goes all the way from campaigning in elections to persuasion, just political speech. People are studying that, how actual campaigns are conducted, that kind of retail politics, as they say, but then all the way into government institutions and how they generate information. Because, in fact, for most advanced countries, Canada is one, the United States is another, the whole EU, any place that sort of has an affluent economy and relatively advanced technology, government agencies are primary sources of information generation, of expertise of all kinds, right? And this has always been true in governments. So now we're kind of past the early stages of just can, this or that government agency get a website. Now it's the whole control of what kind of information is available. So I think technology has suffused governments the way that certainly in advanced societies, the way advanced in the sense of developed, most developed societies. I don't mean advanced culturally by any means, but in terms of economic development. So I think governments are looking for ways to use these technologies at every level, right from the citizen all the way up through institutions. Now, I recently wrote a piece for a book edited by Bill Dutton, actually a brand new one, and my article was about citizens and citizenship and the data subject. And data subject being a term of art that we know from the GDPR in the EU, and privacy legislation that is going on around the world. But the question of what constitutes a person, what constitutes a citizen, a political subject, is a different thing than a data subject. And yet most governments now that are tech-enabled and are very interested in this kind of information about citizens, are busy not just collecting, but compiling and having whole dossiers and long-term data captured themselves. This is not just on the commercial side, of course. Governments are in on this too. So it's hard not to look at what governments are up to, and sometimes in league with the corporate or private sector aspects of the economy, and say, people are more and more being treated as data subjects. That's what they are, first and foremost. It's almost as though we are constituted because of our data, not as being natural beings, but the data cloud that surrounds us, our data footprint, as people say. And there's all kinds of terms that have been used in the literature: data shadows, data doubles. There's all of this terminology that people are trying to get their heads around, this idea of the individual citizen, the political subject, as constituted through data, through what we know about them. Thousands upon thousands of data points being compiled on every single voter in the last couple of American elections. Every single person, every voter. It's quite remarkable. So I think the main complication that I see there is that governments have also gotten wise to their role as controllers of information. When I was in graduate school and when I was younger, we were just talking, of course, about government institutions as major creators of information, as generators of information and knowledge. They support all kinds of knowledge generation activities, research of all kinds, geographic, biological, whatever it happens to be. There's all kinds of information being generated by governments. And at least the tradition in the United States had always been kind of like the government printing office. We just make this stuff available. That it's paid for by taxpayers. Here it is. We provide it and we maintain it, and we have big depository libraries that get everything the government creates. Well, since around the time of the George W. Bush administration, there has been a turn in the American federal system toward turning on and turning off certain types of information, takedowns of data from government websites, which for my colleagues who are archivists and librarians is just horrifying. Okay. George W. Bush famously said no government website after he was inaugurated would have the term global warming any longer associated with it. Okay. These kinds of things, certain kinds of data sets, climate data sets being removed, being taken down if they don't suit the political climate of whoever's in charge. This, I think, is a new thing for ostensibly democratic governments to do. So ironically, perhaps, these new technologies and the facility with which we're able to create and circulate and publish information also makes it trivial to stop it, to turn it off. And one of the things that's dismaying to me, for example, is this is true from private sector, but also I think increasingly government websites that go to the Internet Archive. If you know about Brewster Kahl's organization in San Francisco, which has been going on for a couple of decades now, where they send little bots out and they crawl the web on a regular basis and capture everything, okay? And it's a lifesaver if you're a researcher, if you want to find an old version of a website. Well, increasingly, private firms particularly are going to the Internet Archive and saying, for various kind of specious intellectual property reasons, things like that really shouldn't apply in a case like this. They're saying, we want you to take down everything related to us. A lot of people saw the right to be forgotten in the European Union's recent regulations as kind of in this same space. Like, who gets to decide what disappears? Okay, and it's very easy to make that stuff disappear. My archivist friends have an old principle from a long time ago. They said lots of copies keep stuff safe. Locks, they called it. It's really easy to turn off a website, but it's really, really hard to go capture all the hundreds of thousands of copies of a particular report that was published in 1956. Somebody's got it somewhere. It exists. So one of the things about the digital technology is that it's very, very easy to lose. It's very, very easy to delete. It's very, very easy to selectively pick and choose what goes away. And so I think that's one of the things that governments are getting more into. We would expect this from authoritarian governments for sure, but even in democracies, it's happening.
So what you're saying is that it's a lot easier for governments to control and manage the information that is available about
Absolutely.
their activities. And this is the opposite of what we thought 10 years ago.
Yes.
Because then we thought we were going to have more access to information and things would be more transparent. And what
Yes.
you're almost saying is not just that, no, they won't be as any more transparent. You're saying they'll be less transparent as a result of technology.
They have the opportunity to be less transparent than they were. Now, it depends on the values of the society. It depends on the values of the government and what it claims to uphold. And we'll see how it rolls out. But that's why I was saying that it's ironic. Here's another one of those assumptions. Not only are digital technologies inherently democratic, they're inherently transparent. And so it depends on how they get used. And for people with a reason to suppress or restrict information, it's easier than ever.
And for climate change, there is some broad awareness or some awareness that that has changed as far as a number of governments, presumably, but certainly the US, that has, the idea that information about climate change has disappeared is something that a lot of people are aware of. But also, I guess, and more, recently, with COVID, information about that the government does have about various aspects of COVID, there are all sorts of questions about how much of that is made available to the public and which elements of it are made available and the impact of that too.
Yeah, just one little case regarding COVID. The Trump administration's treatment of the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, which has been the gold standard of understanding all kinds of disease states, but especially infectious disease. This has been its calling card, and they have published for decades a little weekly newsletter. And it's, I took some microbiology classes many years ago. And our teacher made us subscribe to the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, the MMWR. And the MMWR is considered the last word in the reporting of how many cases of whatever it was, especially for infectious disease, throughout the United States, week by week. Okay, everybody reports to the CDC. Well, the Trump administration basically broke that relationship between local healthcare providers and the CDC. And now they have had somebody in place, and I think some of the Trump, I don't know all of the details, but they have wanted to basically craft or edit what is getting reported in the MMWR. And for infectious disease specialists, it's like their hair is on fire. What do you mean? How can you even think about doing it this way? This is just the crafting of scientific information to suit a political convenience, right? And so if we were still subscribing, I'm going to, defend my archivist friends again. If we were still subscribing to the MMWR as a weekly, twofold newsletter, and it comes in the mail, those would exist someplace. And they were just as reliable as clockwork. And you can't you can't unring that bell. Once it's out there, it's out there. Okay. But these technologies, the networked technologies, make it trivial to make those changes. And so creates this contestation, creates these new arenas for contestation over knowledge itself, over what is actually known and understood. And we are suffering the consequences right now in the United States. There's no question about it.
In economic data, there are quite not necessarily clear, but there are specifications for the information that the government has to provide. But in many other areas, there are not. That is, and it does seem to suggest that we might move in the future to a point at which there are clear, specifications, regulations for the information that should be publicly available, and that this is, sacred in some way.
Yeah. I read The Economist every week, and one of the things that they will do when they're talking about certain regions of the world or talking about the economic prospects of this or that nation is that they will talk about whether or not their state agencies are reporting reliable data.
Yeah.
And there's some countries that they're just saying, forget it. There's no way to get true, good information from, I'll just pick on one for a long time that they had problems with, Argentina.
Yeah.
It's like the data just aren't reliable. Okay. Well, economists know, where there's a good agency doing that collection and setting those standards, and they know where they're not, and they know where they're politicized. And so I think this just creates more opportunity. The technologies can be abused in this way, and if they can be, they will be.
Mm-hmm. Sad.
Yeah.
So the next area then, we have a few to cover. We could, as you said at the beginning, we could spend a long time on each one.
Yeah.
But I'll move on to the next one, which is the impact on the media. So in the past, the media was expected to keep government accountable and to provide a critical perspective. How effective do you think they are at this today and or will be in the future?
Yeah. Another piece that I wrote for the new Handbook of Digital Media and Communication that I edited with Brian Loader from York University looks at the piece that I wrote with a colleague of mine, uses journalism and the press in the United States as a historical example for employment, for a certain kind of white-collar employment. That back in the days when, we were talking about the information society, we thought, oh, everybody's going to be a white-collar worker. Everybody will be well paid. This is a bright future because we're getting people out of the factories. We're automating the dirty, dangerous work, and education will be better for more people. And, so 50% of our GDP and 50% of our workforce are now in these jobs, and it's just going to get bigger and bigger and better. Didn't turn out that way. And so over 60 years, we have gone from this kind of bright white collar future to gig labor. Okay. And our poster child for this has been journalism. And my colleague, Britt Paris, who is at Rutgers University, and I both picked this example because we both went to journalism school, at vastly different times. But when you look at the prospects, it's kind of archetypal white collar, informed, educated work. It's highly skilled. It kind of has all of those elements to it. And I think one of the things that is obvious is that digital technologies have been adopted by people in ways that have left aside a lot of the conventional forms of the news and of the press. Okay, so it's well understood that the news industry has been decimated, right? Jobs layoffs have been huge. In the United States, we've lost, not only are we down to one daily paper, which is what by the 1980s, that was true. There was a whole big round of consolidation in the media well before the internet arrived. But now some big cities don't even have a daily actual published newspaper. Seattle doesn't have one. Denver doesn't have one. Okay. Online versions that are much truncated, but nothing like the Post-Intelligencer in Seattle, for example. So we have seen the industry just get chewed down, and there's a lot of finger pointing about that, and looking at the internet, and also people who don't want to subscribe, they want to get all their information free of charge, that kind of thing. So what that has done, it has removed the press in some ways. It has certainly decimated their workforce. And you need that workforce to do that kind of accountability watchdog reporting. And that is expensive reporting. Intensive, long-term, Watergate-style reporting is high dollar. And news organizations are very few of them anymore have the kind of capitalization to really allow that kind of thing. And even in cases like the New York Times, where they've tended to drift toward things that are a little more sensational, a little more human interest kinds of things, rather than not quite as much political and economic analysis as they used to have. Basically, if we talk about the news industry today, we're talking about this hyper fragmented landscape of little organizations that are getting more and more specialized. And it's difficult for citizens to get the big picture. It's difficult. It's really hard to be well informed. It's really hard. And you have to spend a lot of time on it. And at the same time that people are having to work more, economic downturns and difficulties that people are having, healthcare crises, so forth, where can you go to get that kind of accountability reporting? It's getting harder and harder and more expensive, ironically, as more of the news organizations that have survived have discovered paywalls. And, if you had to pay, $10 a month to this one and this one and this one and this one, after a while, your media budget adds up beyond your cable bill, beyond your ISP, all of those expenses that come along with trying to stay informed. So I think accountability is shaky right now. And I think this is tied up with part of this reason of the shift toward authoritarianism. It is possible for people to take that kind of political line if there's no check on them. And the press is not that strong a check, I think, in recent years. They're not showing themselves to really be doing as much of that as they might be doing. Now, the interesting thing is that more people think of the media as things like Facebook, okay, or YouTube on Google, or Twitter. Their Twitter feed is where they get news, or they get these news streams that are aggregated, algorithmically aggregated. But those are targeted, again, to them specifically based on surveillance of them as consumers. So again, this militates against getting the big picture or having a broad understanding of the basic things that affect us. So I would just say the platforms have changed the media in a couple of ways. Number one, business model, right? They are only and always about advertising. They're kind of agnostic about what content even goes out. Whatever it is people will look at is what they will serve up. And what that suggests is that the gatekeeping function, which has always been so critical to valuable or reliable news, gatekeeping, editing, right, are kind of getting pushed aside because it's only about advertising. It's like we used to talk about the wall between advertising and editorial on a newspaper, for example. That wall is pretty much gone for many, many organizations, and advertising really runs the whole enterprise. People see platforms as news media, but they're really not. That's not their business. Their business is not to provide citizens with the information they need to function, in a democracy. That's not their purpose. And in fact, they fight very hard against lately this is really coming to a head. You see it with Facebook particularly, because so much of their news feed, has been an aggregation. And so people associate Facebook with the news. But they are adamant that they should not have to do any editing, So now they're kind of doing it on the backside, cleaning up after the fact with content moderation, right? With all the nastiness, all the ugly business that people will post, all of the misinformation, disinformation, the deliberate crafting of bad information and the circulation of false material, okay? They don't want to be held responsible for that. And that was the deal that we got with the old media, that we got with the news when it was print and it was broadcast. In each of those cases, there were different legal and technological constraints on them that said, in order to have this First Amendment privilege, we will expect that you are also socially responsible. Facebook has no public service obligations whatsoever. Okay. Twitter doesn't. We have to rely, as people say, on the whims of a couple of millionaires. We think Jack Dorsey of Twitter has probably got maybe a better conscience than, Zuckerberg has got, but that's all we've got. Okay. To say, will they be good citizens? Will they inform us in a way that we need to get good quality information? They don't want to be gatekeepers. They don't want to be media, in fact, and yet that's precisely the way that their users perceive them. So it's, it's what happens when their entire business model revolves around, and understandably so. I mean, they're private companies. This is what they do. They're maximizing profit. It's their mission. And the way to do that is with advertising, and they have stumbled onto this highly targeted advertising model that is just the goose that laid the golden egg and keeps laying them. So they don't want anything that's going to mess with that model, while at the same time trying to present themselves as responsible. It's an interesting conundrum, but gatekeeping is I think, the editorial function is really key to this, and this is what's kind of now being contested.
And presumably in a world that is changing more quickly, that has a number of hazards for people at the moment, it's more important that we have, high quality journalism and reporting, so that we can understand the world and make good decisions. It's going to be much harder for us to do that without it.
Yes. And, we're now on the positive side, I think there have been the emergence of some new kinds of news sites that are much more specialist. For example, I really like Marcy Wheeler's Empty Wheel blog, for example. She has a PhD in, I think, comparative literature, but she happens to really drill in and do these kind of close reads on legal issues. And lots of lawyers read her blog for right up to date things that are going on. There's one that I look at called Tech Dirt, and Michael Masnick runs this. And he is both a Silicon Valley, tech head and an attorney. And he drills in on all kinds of policy matters related to the tech industry and media generally too, whether it's speech questions, whether it's decency, whether it's patent law. He particularly really gets in on patent law and copyright. So you kind of have to pick and choose. There are these specialist sites coming up. The other one that I really like, and I'm working on a little case study of it right now, is Bellingcat. And I don't know if you know of them. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
they're being reported today.
Yeah. And the fact that these amateur, they're not exactly journalists, but again, this gets back to the theme of data. What they are taking the information, public facing, publicly available, not secret, not, dangerous information, and simply applying analytic tools and their own eyes, comparisons, using all kinds of comparative information for data verification of images, verification of information. And the interesting thing about Bellingcat is that they are teaching their techniques to journalists, right? So they're kind of completing the circle, saying, okay, journalists, you talk about data journalism and you're interested in that, but here's how you've really got to get down into this information to figure out if you're being fooled. What is not just plausible, but what is verifiable. And there are going to be new standards of verifiability, I think, that have to arise that are linked to this technology. How do we know what we know? It's pretty fundamental.
Yeah, we all need to be better educated, more aware of what we're reading and where we can get accurate information. And this is something that all citizens require more and more skill in than they did in the past.
Absolutely.
Okay, so activism, I want to turn back to that again to talk a little bit about how it will develop in the future. You've talked about consumer activism, data activism, and design activism. Can you talk about what those different views are of technology-influenced activism?
Yeah, I think, as I was saying before about protesters today, we've seen a lot of this with the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, and of course the Hong Kong democracy movement. I was saying before that activists are getting smarter about how they are being watched and then using that kind of in a defensive way. Data activism is a term, I don't know if it was coined by Stefania Milan. She's at the University of Amsterdam, but she certainly is the scholar most associated with it. And it basically recognizes that the field of contention is data. It's what's known about us. It is about this information in the world that exists and is circulated. And some of it's reliable, some of it's not. Some of it is, there's lots of it, some very little. And so she kind of paints this broad brush picture of activism having to do with interventions into data, using data. She's got a couple of different ways. You know, you can either do it defensively or you can basically apply active measures where you intervene in the data directly. Design activism is kind of similar. It comes out of architecture schools, design schools, and there is a kind of a long, not that long, maybe a decade, 15-year history now of design schools saying we need to be designing things that are not just useful and aesthetic and helpful to people, but they also have to be ethical. You know, they have to be sourced correctly. They have to be not wasteful of environmental resources, those kinds of things. And it came out of that idea, but now it's being more and more applied to the information itself, that we see more graphic designers, for example, involved in data visualization and how information is represented to people. So we're seeing design activism that way, saying we need to focus on the information itself and on the data itself, the quality of it, how it is represented, and whether that's faithful or true to what's really going on. Beyond accuracy, it's like how to misrepresent things. So those are a couple of big categories, but some things that I'm really interested in lately are a little bit more interventionist on the data side. One that is particularly interesting is data rescue. And before we were talking about climate data, and this is a big topic, and if among these activists, because they know that different governments under different administrations, different politics, corporate lobbying that goes on, all kinds of interests are contending and at play. And climate science is one that we're very aware of. And so that climate data may go up and then come down, and maybe it's government funded and it's published in a journal, and then you can't get the background data or the website that the government used to maintain that had all of that in that, in the website the data was maintained. Suddenly you can't get access to that particular study, those kinds of things. We saw a lot of climate data being removed from US websites, government websites. At the start of the Trump administration, there was a bit of this with George W. Bush, but there was a lot of it at the start of Trump. And so some of our students at UCLA were actively involved in data rescue operations, where they would get together and teach each other how to go find these data sets, how to, things from government websites that are not always very easy to get down and drill in. So our students specializing in informatics would be able to try and identify those data sets and try and download them wholesale, store them elsewhere, so that then they could be restored or findable in some other way, but to secure them. So we are seeing more of that kind of data rescue activity. And I would imagine there's some of that going on with COVID right now. But it's hard because the healthcare providers are in such crisis mode. It's very hard for them to even be keeping consistent records. But we do see, like at Johns Hopkins and a couple of other places, some very interesting amateur ad hoc projects starting up where people are trying to go capture this data if it's not being captured, if it's not being recorded, and then reinstate it if it's being actively sabotaged or taken down. So data rescue. There's another area called civic hacking, where several people have written about this. As it suggests, it has more to do, it's often more to do with local government, but the question is, what kind of information does the government provide? What do they collect? And how can we get at it, right? So, for example, policing data. This has become an extraordinary important aspect with Black Lives Matter activists, for example, who are concerned with violent policing or abuses of police power. When in the United States, we have a zillion different sources for police statistics, and not all of them are consistent and not all of them are complete. And they tend to cherry pick, right? And so, for example, a few of my students and some others a few years ago got together and ran a hackathon at UCLA that brought in community activists, journalists from the LA Times, which happened to have the best police officer involved homicide data, not the police department, not the state of California, not the county of Los Angeles, but the LA Times. And epidemiologists, all kinds of people came together, and informatics students, to say with the community, what do you know about the shootings in your area? Because very often the grassroots knows, where there have been shots fired. They know if there was a funeral. They know things that don't get reported in the press. And it turns out the two reporters at the LA Times that were keeping their database, which is vastly different from that of the LAPD, they were using all different kinds of sourcing to come up with their numbers. And so civic hacking is about gathering grassroots alternative measurements that say, rather than wait for the cop to report it, every neighborhood, every zip code, every neighborhood watch group, every, little church congregation knows something about their neighborhood. Let's find out and do it that way. Can we create data for ourselves? Can we capture it? So civic hacking, there's a nice study that happened after Superstorm Sandy in New York City and the whole East Coast, of course, some years ago, and how the data that was reported afterwards from FEMA, from the Federal Emergency Management people, was very slanted in favor of some very wealthy communities, and yet some other ones that really needed relief and support and so forth just weren't being surveyed. Okay, certain zip codes just weren't getting as much data gathered about the damage that had been done as other ones. So there were local people that put together some new local sources of data. So civic hacking is another one. The newest one that I think is very interesting, and that's a few of my students are starting to get very interested in this, is what's called crisis informatics. What happens when there's a big event and there's all these scattered sources of information? Where do we go? How do we judge the quality of the information? What's being left out? a little bit like the civic hacking. And just how do we account for the crisis? What kind of data is being gathered about the crisis? And this is why I say COVID may make a big difference with this one. This is the way that I think activism is going, is that there are more and more people beginning to recognize that, for example, it isn't only systematic racism in the United States. It is that means certain kinds of data is gathered and other kinds of data is not. Some kinds of data are taken down and hidden. Some are featured more than others. Some of them, and increasingly communities are recognizing that the way that they are treated by their government depends on what data the government has about them. And so how do we as citizens have a say in how that works? And not just a few politicals or not just a few, experts, but having more participation of the community in the whole process. In the United States this summer, as word of things like George Floyd's killing came out, and these were individual outrages, right? These sparked lots and lots of public unrest, a lot of public protest. But for every George Floyd, every neighborhood says, we got somebody like that. There's way more George Floyds that we know about, who are reported out in different ways, right? They died in police custody. Well, how exactly? Well, that's not always clear. So the data matter, and the data are what drive policies very often. And so being able to participate in the question of what data counts and whether it exists at all, I think is a real important move that's going on with activism.
And so what you're describing is that activism is changing to respond to the new conditions that exist within society and within politics and government. Would you say that you were optimistic or pessimistic about what all of this might mean for the future of democracy and perhaps for the future of life more generally?
Well, I think it's easy to be pessimistic right now in the midst of what are really global challenge events. I mean, things on a massive scale that probably you and I in our lifetimes, we've never seen anything like it. So it's kind of hard to compare. But I would say people are resourceful. And I think that, once you get past the big challenge, the big hit of the struggles of, just kind of getting along day to day, they will use the tools they have to do things in new ways, to try and find workarounds. I've always had this belief. This is the thing about computation. And, some of my colleagues think I'm a little Pollyanna about this, but I used to tell my students, look, it's really hard to hack radio. Okay. It's really hard to hack printing. Okay. These are not technologies. They're kind of single-use technologies. Broadcasting does one thing. Motion picture film does one thing. Okay. You can adapt it for different reasons, but it was built for purpose. The interesting thing about digitally based technologies of all kinds, whether it's the physical devices or the software, anything about that, is that they are meant to be manipulated. They're built to be rebuilt. They're built to be recrafted and innovated and all of those things, right? Now, we may try and lock that down with intellectual property laws. We may try and lock that down with suppression of certain kinds of technologies. Here in the United States, we tried to do it with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. which we used to say, if you took this thing literally, especially the anti-circumvention provisions of the DMCA, you couldn't invent a photocopier today, okay? Because it might be used to infringe. Okay. All right. It has illogical outcomes, right? So people will try and repress some of these technologies, but they're meant to be rebuilt. They're meant to be tinkered with, okay? In a way that once you kind of had television, broadcast television in place, it's pretty stable. It is what it is. It's not to say that internet technology hasn't stabilized quite a lot, and we have certain standards that are now very durable and are going to be hard to change. But still, I think people will begin to innovate. I think this may be an opportunity where people say, the current situation is just such a flaming mess that we've got to use the tools we've got. We've got to come up with something that works better for us. And whoever manages to do that will do very well. I think right now, I forget where I read it, but a few people are beginning to say we should be preparing for something like the Roaring '20s that came after the pandemic, and after the First World War. Once the lid comes off, there's going to be so much demand, so much eagerness for not just a restoration of what there was before, but pushing some boundaries and saying, this just demonstrated that some things don't work. Maybe that's going to be political. Maybe that's going to be cultural lifestyles. Maybe it's going to be, who knows? There's social relationships, technological for sure. I think that the business models of the big platforms, especially since social media, they've kind of gotten ossified in a lot of ways. They've gotten locked up. And I have the feeling that, where even things like two-sided markets, like Uber, right? Networks, two-sided networks. That's kind of a known model now. It's very entrenched. But it wouldn't surprise me, because of the problems that we've seen with things like platform capitalism, right? It's like that people aren't going to be looking around. I think people will be looking around for new ways to do things. And so I don't want to be technologically deterministic. I want to go back to that for a minute and says, no, we're not going to sit around and wait for technology to save us. That's not going to happen, In fact, what we have seen is that the technology that we thought was going to be such a salvation, of course, can be co-opted, can be subverted, can be used in ways that the inventors never imagined. Okay, so that's always true. And that means it's open-ended, and there are more things we can imagine, different ways to imagine what we do with technology and when and how it's appropriate. I'm finally beginning to see people, my husband and I, there's a lot of stuff we don't do. Like, we don't have Alexa speakers in our house. We don't do that. We are not on Facebook. I never was on Facebook. It just looked like a racket to me from day one. And I don't have enough time to spend all that time on it. But the privacy problems, when people begin to realize that Alexa, that little speaker in your house, is not a speaker, it's a microphone. It's there all the time. It's waiting for you to talk. Okay. People are beginning to go, now, wait a minute, is that something I've really got to have? Here's a consequence. We go to a friend's house that does have Alexa, and they're happy with it, and they use it to run the radio and, ask questions and this and that. But then you have friends come over, and our voices are now being recorded. And those go into databases. We didn't give them permission for that. Okay. So, I think this Internet of Things question, could be very promising, but it's starting to look a little creepy. And people are starting to feel that way. So how can we get back our autonomy? How can we get back some sense of control over what is going on? And so I think there's going to be plenty of opportunities for people who want to address that autonomy, that agency that people feel that they are out of control, feel that they don't have good leadership, or they don't have the tools to do what they want to do. There's a lot of convenience, but not a lot of control over what's going on. So I'm optimistic in that respect. And I think once we deal with the immediacy of the emergencies that we have, people will be looking for new ways to reconceive what they do.
So I'm hearing a degree of optimism that people will respond to the negative aspects of what exists today and form new uses, new designs, new applications of the technology,
Yes.
which will be more publicly beneficial.
And I think new regulations. I would have never dreamed 10 years ago that there would be this new wave of antitrust. And I just taught an economics of information class where we read Tim Wu's book, The Curse of Bigness. And, he and there's actually who is it? Lena Khan? I can't remember her first name. But in the Harvard Law Review has this unbelievable article about Neo-Brandeis antitrust. It's like our whole idea of antitrust has been off the rails and really out of the picture since the 1970s and 80s, since the free market became the only, and price became the only way to think about whether or not market power was too great. Okay. Well, what happens when the good is free? There can still be monopolies. There can still be abuses. There can all of these things. And now, it's starting to roll. The whole idea that maybe we should get back to these ideas of breaking up these big firms. They're like the old trusts in many ways. And so I would never have thought that there would be so much public appetite for antitrust. Even 5 years ago, it was just off the table.
Yeah, there was an attitude that the tech companies were in some way our friends.
Yes. Yes. They're not our friends.
No, and people don't think of them as their friends so much anymore.
No, they see them as a threat and as dangerous. And about 10 years ago, I wrote an article in Information Communication and Society that was associated with the 10th anniversary of the Oxford Internet Institute. They had this this event. And then a bunch of us wrote papers, and mine said, there's going to be some big difficulties. We're going to begin realizing that our current history is not being really recorded. We don't, for example, we don't have good ways to archive and keep all this information. People think that once something goes online, it lives there forever. That is just not so.
No.
Digital preservation is an unsolved problem. Another one is like the mean world issue. Increasingly, people see the internet as dangerous. They want to protect their kids. They want to protect themselves. They want, it's just too many difficult, dangerous, upsetting, contentious things going on there. It is a little bit too Wild West for most people. So, it turned from being this wonderful thing that we're, so plugged into, to now a source of addiction and, psychological problems and bullying and, bad politics and every other kind of thing that you can think of. There's still plenty of good and value out there, for sure, but people's opinions have shifted, and that could be a real sea change. That might prompt a rethink.
And that was part of the argument behind European regulation,
Yes.
was that by regulating, these fears would be overcome, and that would enable the benefits that come from technology to be realized. Their argument was that if we didn't do this, then we wouldn't be able to get the benefits.
Well, and it's kind of tragedy, not tragedy of the commons. I guess it is. It's like, here's this common pool resource that there's a bunch of people who are basically, to use a colorful phrase, pooped in the nest.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, they're hurting this common resource.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who have argued, economists over the year, that say, you got to regulate markets or they'll just use everything up.
Mm-hmm.
So especially as we get closer and closer to these kinds of industries that depend on network externalities, on the idea of size and scale, right? First mover advantage. The bigger you get, the more you're worth. We saw this in telecommunications. This is not new.
Mm-hmm.
So, as more of those kinds of natural monopolies, that's a term nobody uses anymore. And yet, these are basically natural monopolies. Mm-hmm. And the only ways that they really work, as happened with AT&T before the divestiture in the 1980s, is that you regulate them. Mm-hmm. They can still make a ton of money, but they need to have a public service obligation. And that willingness is absent until maybe just starting to come back a little bit now.
And their ability to innovate and to, do the important things they do need not be negatively impacted by that at all. Absolutely.
As a matter of fact, Bell Labs, the premier technology development, research and development organization on the planet, it could be argued, right up until the divestiture when they sold off bits of it, okay, because they broke the company up. It was because AT&T had, by itself was the 9th largest, economy in the world, that they had that kind of money and they were putting it back into R&D. And now R&D suffers all the way through the economy. And I think, Google and Facebook, especially Google, has a big R&D arm, but a lot of it is kind of moonshot stuff. They're not, or at least they're not sharing the way that AT&T did, or IBM for that matter. IBM a few years ago decided to go with a patent pool. They were making so many patents they couldn't even use them all. So they said, "Great, people come use our patents. Just give us some credit. We'll share it with you." There has to be some sort of give and take to go with those advantages of scale. And so, we want the benefits of the network externalities, the positive externalities, but now the negative externalities are starting to show. And the way to control the negative externalities, so far as we know, is some form of regulation. Final question. It's been a great discussion, and I think going to be very valuable. But the last question I've got is for the students who are watching this. They will be entering the workforce. Some of them will have already. And so I like to finish my interviews by asking what advice you would want to leave them with. Well, I've got a couple of things. First of all, I'll start with things I'm telling my own students who I can only see on Zoom. And at UCLA, we are very, very cognizant of the stresses on the students. It's the top public university in the country. It's still expensive for a lot of the students that we recruit. It's been a very, very hard time for them. And so some of them have, it's a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress. But something that I tell my advisees is like, well, you're going through this, but here's the thing. When the fog lifts, when we kind of move through this, and historically we will, you're going to have a kind of resilience and adaptability. You're going to be looking for those workarounds. You're going to be trying to solve problems in ways that aren't obvious, because you will have a sense if you can get through this crisis kind of with your feet on the ground and be able to kind of look around you and see what your opportunities are or are not, and what opportunities need to be made rather than simply taken, you will have more capacity to adapt, because you will have dealt with a huge adversity, possibly the biggest adversity you may ever, see in your society. I hope it's, that we don't have something like this again in the near term. But, consider what happens when there are major wars. Consider what happens with big catastrophic calamities, natural disasters, those kinds of things. People have to pick up and adapt. And I think that's one thing that I hope that we're going to see with the current generation of students. But the other things I would say kind of link back to what we were just talking about. There's going to be pent-up demand. There's going to be pent-up creativity. There's going to be things that people want to get out and try, and experiences that they're going to want, and new kinds of work. One of the things that's interesting is that because universities are still, in the United States anyway, are so expensive, and everything's being delivered this way right now, I just saw something where fewer and fewer students, prospective students, I think applications are going to be down in higher education. There may be more people going into more trade type education. Okay, apprenticeships might be a new way of thinking. Different kinds of opportunities than simply the single path and the single, trajectory that says, you go through this kind of training and then you pop out the other side and you go, work in some corporate environment or large institution. I think that there may be this kind of post-COVID moment that some of these students are going to be able, if they're wise enough and nimble enough, to be able to look for new kinds of ways forward. It will take a little bit of creativity to do that, rather than just retreading. And in the area of competition, for example, look at places where there are going to be new spaces for competition, right? Not just more like this. Let's have another DoorDash. It's like, no, let's not have that. Let's have another Instagram. No, let's not have that. Let's open up a little bit and think about new potentials and new, not just also ran kinds of things, but new directions. I don't know if in my class, I used this book by Robert Gordon, which is a real doorstop. Terrific. Gordon is a big, he's an economic historian. And basically he says that in the current kind of 50-year period, or actually let's shorten it up, 30-year period that we think about digital technologies, that we all think this is the golden age of innovation. It's like, well, no. My husband and I were talking about this just the other day. His father was born in 1909 and died about 10 years ago. And he was 93 or whatever age it was. And we would sit and think of what he saw in his lifetime. He saw air travel. Mm-hmm. He saw electrical grids. He saw interstate highways. He saw cars in every household. He saw, refrigeration, and food easily distributed and relatively cheap. And Gordon makes that argument. He's got a couple of TED Talks too, where he kind of says, yes, we've seen some pretty cool things, but they're kind of new ways to do old stuff we were already doing. And in fact, the kind of, for me anyway, since kind of social media showed up, the kind of innovation that we get with the internet is very incremental. It's very, very small bits. It's not like the internet itself. When ARPANET was created, nobody knew how it was going to be used. They thought they had a plan for how it was going to be used, and then it was subverted immediately. And so now what we've done is all these little refinements. Here's a new app. It's like the whole app economy thing. There's got to be a rethink on that. So thinking about a new landscape within which these technologies might play a role, and new ways to use the technologies, new ways to reconfigure them, to do stuff that we're not doing now, and stuff that's been neglected. How might that help? And that's where, design schools, design thinking, that kind of thing is worth doing, because that's their stock and trade. They're trying to get people to think in unconventional ways, in non-obvious ways. And the internet has now been obvious for a while. And I think if we can get to a place where we're doing non-obvious things again, it'll be quite something. So there's a lot. I think there will be some opportunities, but people are going to have to create them.
But I was very interested by what you said there, because what you very clearly communicated to me was that innovation isn't about thinking about the technology, it's thinking about life and how life is going to change. And that's a fairly basic message, and one which, for people who come from a technological background, is probably a very valuable one.
Yes. Well, and the best tech designers are the people who start from the way people live. Mm-hmm. How do we live? I know quite a few people, Paul Durish, Lucy Suchman, some other folks that were part of the research design team in the early days at Xerox PARC in Palo Alto. And, Paul Durish is like the man on the study of ubiquity at the moment. Lucy Suchman, brought anthropology into the study of devices and machines and how you design them. And I think that's where the good stuff comes from. It's like you start with how do we live? How do we want to live? What kinds of values do we want to make sure are expressed in the stuff we want to build, that we want? How is the good society going to happen? Because I've got, not because there's going to be one more delivery app, that doesn't really take us any place right now. So you start from conditions, it's the old line about design, right? Herb Simon said, it's taking a set of existing conditions and converting them into preferred ones. That's what we want. We take the existing and we say, how can this be improved? How can we make our lives better? And not just what's the new dongle that I can build, So, so I think every great disruption, like social disruption, social dilemma or crisis, it's the old line, it has seeds of opportunity in it. And so I think that's what students have got to keep in mind.
Well, Leah, thank you for taking so much time to talk to me today. It's been a great pleasure to meet you and to talk to you today. And
yeah, you too.
I know that it's going to be valuable for the students.